I mean, if you would like to prevent of being visible, then you can turn off the camera for this meeting. So welcome to the seminar. We have two presentations today. The first presentation is by Joanna. We all know Joanna from the work in our group, and she will present her award-winning IST paper on dramaturgy, or I mean, I don't know yet how to pronounce it, but I guess we will learn soon, of critical moments and transitions. And afterwards, we will have a second presentation by Andreas Kopp, and Andreas Kopp is might also be known to many of you from the IST community, and he's currently finishing his PhD at University College London, and his presentation or his thesis is due in a month. So this is also one of the last moments to provide input on his work. So and he's very much looking forward also to receiving feedback. We have 30 minutes for both presentations, and I suggest that we start with Joanna's presentation. So Joanna, the floor is yours, and please start sharing your screen.
Thank you, Jarno. Hi, everyone. I hope everyone is in health conditions. Thank you for the opportunity to present the paper that I wrote together with Franz and also Walter and Martins and Val. Stop sharing my screen here in presentations. So a bit of a disclaimer. I am a newcomer in the transition studies. My background is more on political science, and I start my PhD journey from an empirical case of online taxi or the ride share in Indonesia. And I think that what makes me wonder more is how such innovative options of transportation become very much controversial and also invite conflicts. So in order to do so, I try to look upon inspirations from transition studies and see how conflict has been discussed so far in the transition studies, thanks to Professor Kuhn Franken, who recommended me to read Rip's paper on conflict as informal assessment to the new technologies. Try to look upon the inspiration tracing from those papers. And also in the multi-level perspective, I found that conflict is still dominantly discussed pretty much on the interaction between incumbent actors and the newcomers actors. So in that sense, it makes a puzzle to my case, because when I ask the question, how do I categorize this ride sharing, or how do I categorize this online taxi? I stumble that it is not an incumbent actors, but then it's also not a niche newcomers actors, because there is a critic that trying to provide alternative to the business model of these online taxis. So building up into those puzzles, I try to look at other papers that trying to offer a more complex analysis on conflict, and I found one paper by our colleague Jonas Torrens that discussed conflict as an arena of political contestations. So this paper is trying to further unpack this conflict as an arena, and in order to unpack this arena, or the battleground in Jonas' term, we're trying to mobilize a framework by Martin Hojer, which is the governance as performance framework, which has three important elements. The first element is the critical moments, which refer to a particular time and place where dominant discourse are questioned or unhinged, which potentially allows the shift of the new order of a discourse. And the second element, which I think has already been used a lot in transition studies, is this analysis that is focused on the use of language in use, and enable a deeper understanding on how new concept and storyline can shape and also reshape the way we allocate meanings. And the third element, which we think it could enrich the discursive analysis in the transition studies, is the dramaturgy analysis, that actually aim to understand not only what people say, which already has been discussed in discursive analysis, but also to connect it into how they say it and where they say it, and most important, whom. So in this paper, we're trying to mobilize all of these three elements into the case of online taxi in Indonesia. And we hope it could further unpack the complexity of the conflict and trying to avoid our approach binary view of incumbent and newcomers interactions in transitions. So in order to do that, we're trying to adopt the 10 step of argumentative discourse analysis by Hojers. And we try to divide this 10 step into 3 phases. The first phase is we conducted desk research, which we try to collect online data about the debate of online taxi in Indonesia, mostly using media, online media. And then we follow up this desk research with a helicopter that we interview an expert that we think are having more general knowledge about the debate of online taxi. And then in the second phase, trying to build up an initial timeline of the conflict based on our first phase data collections. And then in the second phase, we're trying to enrich this initial timeline by doing an extensive fieldwork combination between semi-structured interviews with the multi-stakeholders, and then also documents analysis from policy brief, public statement, opinions from the stakeholders. And one important document that we found is the internal meeting notes from the Ministry of Transportation. Fortunate to have access to these meeting notes, so we could understand how does the debate really employed on the real meetings. And then next one is ethnographic observation at the site of argumentation, which is, I think this is one of the most important data if we want to conduct a dramaturgy analysis. So in the beginning, we're trying to video that record a public debate about the online taxi, and then we're trying to find opportunity to observe any street protests conducted both by the conventional taxi or by the online taxis. And then an unfortunate fortunate moment also happened to us when we have access from the Ministry of Transportation to attend and observe their, which was at that time discussing a draft regulation of motorbike taxi. So from this rich data, we come into the third phase, is to synthesize the data into timeline which identified the critical moments. So one good indicator to identify critical moment we found is that when there are multiple actors with different perspectives to one particular event. So we're trying to find out or unpack this particular event or share event and unpack the discursive debate and also the dramaturgy in those events. And next step is the verification reflections. One note from Martin in doing the verification is when we confront our finding to the respondent, they should at least recognize and structured in language. So fortunately, we have opportunity to invite our respondent last year in the workshop of economy conducted by our department, organized by our departments. So in that moment, we were able to present our findings and get some comments and feedback from the respondent. So how does the findings so far, or how is the finding we found? So this is the initial timeline of the conflicts. We try to divide the timeline into 2 timelines. The upper line is the government regulations. As you can see, there are 5 yellow box, which is actually the box for the regulation that issued by the ministry, and there are 2 red box, which is the judicial review from the Supreme Court that annulled or canceled the previous regulation from the ministry. As I recall the comment from the Minister of Transportation, he said that this is the first time in Indonesia where they have to issue 4 different regulations in 2 years for one particular vehicle options. And this is also important regulation because this is the first time in Indonesia they have so-called legal regulation for the motorbike taxi, which was traditionally refer as informal transport. And then here is the timeline of the street movement, which we find that they have a very, how to say, connected to the regulation timeline. The blue box, the protest from the conventional taxis, and then the green box is the protest from the online taxi drivers. And quite interestingly, the purple box is a protest conducted by the online taxi driver, but they are against the online taxi company. So we found there is a shift of movement in this timeline too. So from this initial timeline, we identified 5 critical moments that we believe introduce or bring dynamics, discursive dynamics to the conflict. The first critical moment is when this taxi become a public discursive debate and has been discussed nationwide, which at that time, the dominant narrative or the dominant storyline is online taxi is illegal because it gave unfair competition. The second critical moment is bring another new dynamic because it allows 2 new storyline emerge, which is online taxi is national pride and online taxi is our job. And then the third moment or the third dynamic is when another storyline emerge again that is employed by the Supreme Court, saying that online taxi is inevitable innovation. At least from these 3 critical moments, we can already see that the conflict is not non-binary. It's not only between 2 storylines, but it's somehow discursively constructed by multiple storylines with multiple actors. Another new dynamic we found in next moment is the dynamic of online taxi is our job storyline that was emerged in the critical moment too, now being shifted into online taxi exploit our job. So we found that this is also an evidence to show that how conflict or how storyline is not a static argument, but it is a constructively it is a discursively constructed because of the conflict. And the next moment is a moment when we found most of these multiple storylines employed in one formal meeting room, which is the meeting to draft regulations for the online taxis. And we found in this episode or in these moments, the dramaturgy brings up a lot of complexity to understand the conflict. So in order to unpack the discursive analysis in each of these critical moments, we foreground 2 important elements. The first one is storylines, which mean condensed statements summarizing complex narrative, like one of our example, the online taxi is illegal, or national pride, or exploit our job, or inevitable innovation. But the other element also important is the metaphor, or the explanation of one thing in terms of another. There are so many metaphors that we found was employed during this so-called battleground. 1 or 2 examples of this metaphor is a metaphor employed by the conventional taxi, bound boxer and the versus the bastard. So the conventional taxi perceive themselves as a boxer who are trying to fight, but they are actually bound by rules, regulations, and standards. And their opponent is this bastard, they call it, or they as an illegal actors, which they play without rules. So I think these metaphors does really explain the complexity of understanding how unfair or asymmetrical competition between conventional taxi and online taxis. The other metaphor that we also found interesting, addictions, to explain the conditions of the online taxi drivers, that they are being addicted with the bonus from the online taxi company, but then at the end they don't have any other options because now it's become their full-time job. So that is from the discourse analysis. Next one is also as important as the discourse analysis is the dramaturgy analysis. So how we do, we used 3 important elements in the dramaturgy analysis: scripting, setting, and staging analysis. So in the scripting, which refer to the effort to determine the participating actors, then appropriate behaviors in the performance. So in each of these critical moments, we try to carefully recognize what are the scripting in each of the critical moments and whether there is a counter script appears in these critical moments. And the next one is setting. What is the physical and organizational situation in which the interactions took place, whether it is in the formal meeting rooms, whether it is on the street, but also interestingly, there are also some mobilization or discursive movement happen in the social media, which we argue is also as important as other places. So next one, how's the organization of the interaction between active player and passive audience? So we brought this two discursive and dramaturgy analysis on each of the critical moments, and we trying to to use it in our result. And there are so many complexity that actually I think we're able to be unpacked using this framework. One of example of the benefit using the dramaturgy analysis is when I try to compare a similar event, which is a street protest, but conducted by two different dramaturgy. So the first protest is conducted by the conventional taxis, and the second one is conducted by the online taxis. So we thought in the result, we're trying to explain how does this conducted, and then we thought how the different strategy in scripting and also in setting the events could bring out different outcome toward the employment of the discursive itself. In this case, we found that a protest that conducted by the online taxi driver is much more successful in becoming a dominant narrative compared to a protest that conducted by the conventional taxis. So bringing up to all of, maybe not all of it, but a little bit of this example of using dramaturgy analysis, I come back to the reflections. What do we could learn from using this framework to the debate of online taxi in particular, and also in transition studies in general. So the first one, using this framework, we could understand how transition is a non-binary, complex, and messy process where we argue that conflict should become the focal point of studies. Well, personally, I think that in every disruptive innovation, there will always be conflict follow this innovation. So in that sense, brings more urgency to put conflict as the focal point in the transition studies. Second one, we also argue that employing critical moment as a unit analysis could help to avoid this approach to understand transition that merely understood as interactions between regime and mis, or between incumbent and newcomers actors. And also using critical moment analysis could help to reconstruct the shifting storyline around which the controversy was played out. Like in our case, for example, the first critical moment stated that online was illegal. But then on the fifth critical moment, we could see how now online taxi become legal in Indonesia. So throughout this critical moments analysis, we could see how this change could happen. And the third one, the focus on dramaturgy that accompany critical moment analysis is promising for future transition research. Well, our analysis clearly situates where the conflict transition took place and how it is played out. So in that sense, going into our fourth point, the dramaturgy dimensions also bring up the material perspective on how powers played out in conflict in the context of transition. We found that some actors mobilize material and immaterial resource that they could control, whether it is blocking the car street or trying to orchestrate the meeting room, so they could control other actors and trying to exploit them. And the last one, we have a very substantial critic from our anonymous reviewers saying that our analysis is very much retrospective, which is true. But we could, our premise of our retrospective analysis is that it could develop a new lens to understand, a new lens that are sensitive to politics and place. So we can see the unfolding of historical transition in new ways, which in turn can inform the development of new or adapted prospective transition framework. But in this paper, we don't discuss further for the later, but I think it could be a point for further research for those who are interested to utilize this framework of critical moment, discourse, and dramaturgy analysis. So that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Joanna, for your very clear presentation and a nice story. The floor is open for questions. So if there are any, you can raise your hand or indicate them in the chat or start talking. Any questions? If not, I have a question, but okay, I can start asking a question. I really like the methodological approach, one thing which I find promising and interesting is that you argue also in your own reflection on it that this approach can shed more light on kind of the material aspect of innovation, which somehow I believe is I think very important to innovation studies, but often is also kind of a bit tends to get less attention than the social aspect sometimes. So can you maybe elaborate a bit further on how particular this method is good in kind of shedding new perspectives on the material aspect of innovations?
Okay, I'll try to answer. I think the reflections on how this material perspective could emerge in our analysis came when we discussed, especially on the setting element in the dramaturgy analysis, because conducting this research does also help me as a researcher to be much more sensitive towards any towards the dynamic of the place, towards how actors utilize any materials or immaterials resource in order to mobilize their agenda. Like, for example, I found that in terms of resource, maybe there is some kind of asymmetrical resource have the company of online taxi and also by the driver of online taxi. But when the online taxi drivers conducted that protest, they were able to organize any material that they are in control with, like for example, their car. So in order to fight against these big actors of the company, to mobilize these materials. There are two material immaterial, which I think become one the resource for the driver. The first one is of course their car. They can use their car to block the street or even block the entryway of the company, which then it's also to give some significant effect toward their mobilization. And the second one is the social media. They already much more familiar in using the social media. So in that sense, I think conducting the dramaturgy analysis could open up more material and immaterial options toward our understanding of transitions. Hope that answers.
Yes, it does. Thanks very much. Are there any other questions?
Jano.
Yes, Koen, please go ahead.
I was not able to follow the whole presentation, Joanna, but did the platforms also make use of their material capabilities to punish or survey certain drivers rather than others?
Do you mean whether the platform company use what kind of materials they use to control the drivers?
Well, they have the technological capabilities, algorithmically or otherwise, to influence or punish particular drivers.
Well, I think throughout my fieldwork, I also found that, well, of course, the technological capability is one of their main resource. The other one is, of course, the media control. So they have much more access and network toward national media. And I found that in every protest, in every meetings with the ministry, they've always been followed up by news or that try to put the position correctly for the companies. So I found in that sense media also one of the resource for them.
There's also a question by Ellen.
Yeah, thank you, Suchi. I'm still a bit struggling with this dramaturgy concept. The staging, the setting, no, the scripting, the setting, the staging. I'm not fully convinced what the added value exact is of adding that to find critical moments and to draw these timelines versus doing a regular history event analysis. So when you would have done that, would the outcome not be the same? Maybe accept the point of this materiality, but also in a normal history event analysis, the materiality also pops up when a certain device or road or whatever comes into being.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's a very substantial question, and I try to answer it. So the way we mobilize the three elements in the governance as performance framework is as a layers. So the first time we try to identify this critical moment, and in each of the critical moment, we try to unpack the discursive analysis and the dramaturgy analysis. I think what contributions bring by the dramaturgy analysis, beside the recognition of place and also the recognition of material perspective, is I think it also brings much more a better recognition toward how this discursive analysis, discursive debate played out. Like for example, in some of our critical moments, we could find that a narrative or storyline that brought by marginal actors, in this sense, perhaps drivers, also other marginal actors, somehow they could, they could win or become dominant storyline. And in that sense, why the dramaturgy analysis could bring more arguments to that. Because, for example, because what we found is in every discursive debate with different or unfair or asymmetrical resource that owned by each actors, what we also found that even though it become an unfair competition, that each actors, even the marginal actors, have a way to trying to mobilize this, and the way to do and to understand the way they're doing it is by doing dramaturgy analysis. For me personally, for example, I now understand how social media is very much important as a movement organization for the drivers, because that is one important resource for the drivers. And I as well from the Ministry of Transportation, I know understand from using dramaturgy analysis, how do they orchestrate their meeting room, which is, even though they could claim themselves as inclusive governance, or they would claim themselves as open governance, but the way they construct the meetings itself, there's still some structured political structure confident if we look and recognize better the dramaturgy.
Thank you very much. This makes really sense. It's a good reply. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor.
All right. Yeah, I think if there are no further questions, and I'm also looking